Welcome. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Setting the Scene. My name is Michael. I'm the host for today's podcast. On the fifth overall episode and the third episode of Setting the Scene's episode series, Money Management and Independence, we are joined today by Dr. Frey. Today, we will be discussing managing personal finances as aspiring healthcare professionals. Before we do get started, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience, Dr. Frey?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jordan Fry. I'm a plastic surgeon in Buffalo, New York, and I started practice about a year ago after training. I did my integrated plastic surgery residency at NYU, and then I did an extra year of microsurgery fellowship there. And it was towards the end of that I kind of got interested in personal finance. So I'm excited to talk to all of you.
Sounds great. So I'm sure the first question we all have for someone who's a plastic surgeon is, what was your journey to getting to that point?
Yeah, it was, I don't know, I guess it was roundabout and straightforward at the same time, if that makes sense as I go through it. But I really didn't know anything about plastic surgery until about the end of my third year. I just kind of randomly happened to do a rotation in it. And at that point, I knew I liked surgery, but I wasn't sure what kind. And then I saw plastic surgery and was just like totally in love with it. And so I kind of changed gears at that point from what I thought I was going to go into, and kind of went through the application process and did away rotations and all that kind of stuff, and ended up matching at NYU. And so then I did 6 years of residency there. And that whole time as well, I was trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do. Plastic surgery is a pretty broad field. And I ended up really falling in love with microsurgery. So I did another year of fellowship in microsurgery. And then after that, I finally got a job and started working. And so I do mostly reconstruction. I do some aesthetic surgery, but mostly reconstruction, and a lot of breast reconstruction using microsurgery, and head and neck reconstruction, and lower extremity reconstruction.
Yeah, what a path. So today we want to discuss a little more about financial management, managing personal finances. And I know that you're an expert in that kind of field. Along with your journey, not only in terms of what you did, but also the financial management aspects behind that, how you, when you were maybe in medical school, residency, and fellowship and beyond, what was your journey of managing finances? What was the point that you kind of picked up the tips and was able to apply your knowledge in an effective way? When did that time come around? How long did that take?
Yeah, so it's really easy to summarize my financial management in medical school and residency because there just was none. I basically didn't start, I guess, realizing how important it was, or really like enacting any sort of strategy till the very end of my fellowship, like the last 4 months or so. And so I'd gone through 4 years of medical school, 7 years of training at that point, basically ignoring it all. And I kind of, for context, I paid for my undergraduate, college, and medical school 100% in loans. I didn't have any like family support or big scholarships or anything like that. I paid for them in loans. And so I had a lot of debt, obviously. And going through training and stuff, I basically just deferred that debt. I didn't pay any of it off because I was really scared of it and I didn't know how to manage it. And I just chose to ignore it. And essentially what happened is I kind of got to the end of my training and I realized that I was feeling pretty burned out and not necessarily enjoying things as much as I used to in the realm of medicine and plastic surgery. And I kind of took a step back and tried to figure out why that was. And I ended up realizing that I was really, really stressed out about my financial situation. And I was about to finally graduate and become an attending, which is like, the end of this long road, as you know. And everyone was being like, oh, it's going to be great. You're going to be a plastic surgeon. You're going to be making all this money, etc. And I was like, I don't feel like it's going to be great. I'm $500,000 in debt. I have no savings, no like retirement investments, nothing. I don't even know how to go about that. I have 2 kids. I don't know how to plan for their college. I am going to be moving. I don't know if I can afford a house. I don't even know how to go about that process. And so I was really stressed out about that stuff. And I realized that was a main part of my burnout. So my wife and I ended up sitting and making a decision that we were gonna learn about this stuff so we could come up with a plan. And so we started doing that. We realized it was a lot simpler than I thought it was going to be. I realized that a huge component was just that I was really scared and intimidated of my mistakes. Um, and once I finally looked at them and then I could take the next step of actually like figuring out how to make them better. Um, and then once I did that, we came up with a plan. I was still a trainee. We were living in New York City with 2 kids on 1 income, and so I didn't make a cent more. But at that point, just having a plan just helped me so much. And I realized that my well-being got a lot better and that I actually became a better doctor because I was focusing more on what was important. I didn't always constantly have this worry in the back of my mind. Because again, even though I didn't make a cent more, I said, I have this plan. And if I follow this plan, I can pay off my debt in 5 years. I can establish like a good financial foundation. I can assure myself that, if I practice whatever, and I'm going to be able to retire when I want comfortably. And just having that in the back of your mind is such an important thing. And there's too many, as you may have seen already, but there's too many physicians that never just develop that plan and then get into a lot of trouble because the one thing about physicians is we make a lot of money, but we're not really good at managing it. And if you make $1 million, but you spend $1 million, then you're still, your net worth is zero. You're definitely not wealthy or rich. You're poor. And there's a lot of doctors that unfortunately go through that. So that was a kind of long-winded answer that I gave you, but that's sort of where it started, and how it started.
Absolutely. And there was a lot of great insight there that you were kind of rolling out with. First of all, I picked up on how you mentioned, I've heard this once or twice before, but I don't think it's actually as focused on or as understood as it should be, with how physicians are not only dealing with one burden in financial management, it really affects all of their life. Just like you said, when you were able to
Yeah.
overcome that barrier, overcome that hurdle of financial burdens, you were able to become a better doctor through that, right? So
Mhm.
it really is more than just one problem that it creates. That's a great insight that not many people really take the time to understand and think about. And it just goes
Yeah.
to show how important financial management is.
Yeah, and I think a big thing around doctors is, talking about money or finances is kind of like taboo because people think, well, I'm a doctor, I'm going to be a doctor. I didn't get into it for the money. And that's true. That's certainly not why I got into it. And I get, much more fulfillment out of caring for patients than anything financial. But to completely ignore it is also not responsible, and it's not responsible to your own well-being and truly to your patients, because there's too many physicians that are doing things that are financially motivated, that are maybe not in the best interest for themselves or for their patients. And the other thing I'll just throw in quick is another reason that I talk so much about this stuff is I've truly, and I say this honestly, I've yet to meet someone who was in as deep of a financial hole as I was when I started this process, when I first started learning about it, in terms of how in debt I was, both with student debt and consumer debt, like credit card debt, how little savings I had, how little knowledge I had, etc. And so I just always like to say, there's definitely nothing special about me. And I started out probably worse than anyone who is listening to this podcast or otherwise. And so if I can do it, anyone can do it. So that's just a really important point I want to put out there.
That's a great point. And to tag along with that, for our audience who really are mainly either aspiring pre-health students or pre-health students already themselves, trying to aim for that, eventual attending position or just in
Mm-hmm.
general, a job in healthcare, a career in healthcare. In the
Mm-hmm.
midst of medical education, whether you're a pre-med, a medical student, or a resident, financial management is just another hurdle over, what we already have with training, with a busy schedule. All in all, you're really juggling a lot of things all at the same time. So with that said, for the pre-medical student listening in, trying to stay financially responsible and avoid the times where, as a medical student or as a resident, you're constantly worrying about the loans, the financial burden just in general. If they want to be financially responsible from the start, what's your advice to that student listening in as to how they can alleviate the financial burdens from the get-go?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in terms of, I'll speak specifically first to like the someone listening who's pre-medical or in medical school. I think the biggest thing, single-handedly, the biggest thing you can do at that point is just start thinking about it. Just start educating yourself a little bit, even if it's just reading one book on personal finance a year. And some great ones are like The Richest Man in Babylon or The Millionaire Next Door. Just books that are more even philosophical, that just start to get you thinking about these things. Because the goal at that point is really to create some habits or some healthy kind of thought processes around money that will continue, because it's tough when you're pre-med or in med school. You're in the phase of life you're not making money. You're basically just going into debt with the prospects of making money later on. So it's hard at that point to do things to sort of increase that net worth or etc. The most actionable thing that I always tell people kind of at those stages are, you want to work to minimize your debt as much as possible. And that's sort of like taking out as little as possible, just kind of to cover what you need. And how do you do that? Being thoughtful about where you go to school. And I can say, I always have a tough time recommending that, because on the one hand, yes, going to a medical school that costs, like 50,000 a year or plus at this point, probably, versus a state medical school, is the education you're going to get that much better? Honestly, probably not. So that's certainly one way you can reduce your debt burden. But the flip side of that is, so in my situation, I was really stubborn. I knew, my parents had told me there wasn't money to help with my education, so I was going to have to cover it. And I went to two private, very expensive, undergraduate and medical school, because that's what I felt was the best, and I thought was the most prestigious, and I wanted to go to. That in itself is not necessarily the right reason to do it, but it just so happened that the private school I was considering for medical school ended up having a plastic surgery program. The public school, state school that I was considering, between those two, didn't. So I don't know if I would have found my calling if I went to that other school. And that's totally an anecdotal kind of thing. So that's something to consider, but I don't think that's the end all be all. I do think the thing you have to keep in mind at that point is like, if so I ran a calculation, which at the beginning of my residency, which was 7 years, for each dollar that I didn't spend on paying down my loans and instead spent on something else, like maybe ordering food out or something like that, by the time I finished my training, that was worth like $10. So, and you can imagine if that goes back to undergraduate or medical school. So there's obviously things you need to eat. You need to, spend some on entertainment so you don't go crazy. But just being cognizant and trying to live within a budget, or at least saying like, okay, I'm going to spend every month on entertainment, but this is my limit. Or I'm going to go on a vacation, but I know I'm not going to go on some, tropical vacation or something like that. I'm going to instead do this. So I think those are kind of the most important things in my mind. And when you're in pre-med, when you're in medical school, when you're in residency, again, the most important thing is learning to be the best doctor that you can be. And what I am just trying to advocate for is there's kind of simple habits that you can build and simple things that you can do to just set yourself up for success later on, that you can kind of do it and forget about it. And those are the things that you want to kind of enact. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort or take away from that medical training, which should be your focus.
Absolutely. And as you kind of went through that, it's really interesting to hear how multidimensional this journey is. It's not just that you take 4 years medical school, then maybe a 3-year residency. It's not really uniform for everyone. It's so different, especially in terms of management, finances. Whether you're going to go to state school or private, is it going to be in-state, out of state? Are you going to be taking a job up? All of those are variables that make it so much more different. And just like you said, especially with savings, that's more something that everyone can do. It's not necessarily something based on if you were accepted this school or that school. It's like more of a deliberate thing that everyone has the option to do, and it's definitely going to pay dividends in the end. So
Yeah.
speaking of the general pre-medical, medical student, and resident population, are there any key points to financial management that really go overlooked or unmentioned? And you think that there should be more focus dedicated to those?
Yeah, I think like just about everything. I mean, once so in pre-med and medical school, I really do think the focus on loans, and like I can give an example from my medical school. I think, maybe once we sort of had like a 5 minute something from a loan officer at the school being like, oh, these are the different loans and this is, what you want to do when you graduate, etc. But there needs to actually be some like education about that. So for instance, there's something called the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which you may be aware of. And they've actually recently just adjusted it so it's applicable to more people. But essentially, what it says is you pay your loans and you pay an amount based on a percentage of your income. And if you do that for 10 years, then the rest of your loans get forgiven. So it's a really great thing. So I was in training for 7 years and I didn't pay off 1 cent of any of my loans because, like I said, I was ignorant and also just wanted to ignore them. And I didn't have the education, so I didn't even know about this program. If I had just paid very small amounts for those 7 years, I would only have 3 more years to pay, and then my loans would be forgiven. But instead, I would have to start now and do it for 10 years. And since my income's higher, I would pay a higher amount, and really any benefit would be gone. So that's an example of where I think, you know, medical schools, if the cost keeps rising, and I think they have an obligation, like a duty to its students to really educate them about all these loans they're taking out. Because in no other situation would anyone give, like a 21-year-old with no actual work experience and no financial backing, like $200,000 to of debt. In no other situation, you have to educate them about that. In residency, then you're starting to make a salary. It's not, a ton or anything like that, but you're starting to actually make money. And I think at that point you have to, there's just basic tenets of personal finance, which I didn't even know or understand, or like were foreign concepts when I learned them. It seems so simple when you kind of spell them out. But so for instance, you want to save some money. You don't want to just spend all of the money you make. That sounds like such a simple thing, but I just spent all the money that I made because I just thought that's what you do. That's sort of the way I grew up, not necessarily seeing the most healthy financial habits. And that's just kind of what I did. And so, in residency, are you going to be able to save 50% of your income? No, because you just don't make enough at that point. But if you save 5, 10%, if you learn to put that into a retirement account that your residency has for you, and you can grow that money, those are really good habits that then once you become an attending, you're going to go, oh, you know what? Now I'm going to save even more and I'm going to invest even more and I'm going to set myself up to be financially independent, which basically means that if I don't want to, I don't have to work anymore. Now, like for me, that's a goal of mine to get to financial independence, not because I don't want to work anymore. I mean, I just started working and I love it, but I'm also a lot happier when I'm doing something because I want to do it rather than I have to do it. So even just very simple things like that. And so I'm a big advocate for, in medical school, in residency, to have some element of personal financial education. And again, not something to take away from the medical education, which is the most important, but just something to help people at least understand these topics and develop the habits that are gonna, serve them well throughout their career.
Absolutely. And shifting a little more to your specialty in specific, I was wondering about the patient populations. I know that some people listening in might be interested in different specialties, so they also might want to ask you, if they were here, they would maybe want to ask you a little about your own specialty, being plastic surgery, because again, it's a very competitive specialty, very desired specialty.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure many people are interested. So in terms of your specialty, are there plastic surgeons that set the majority of their patient population allocated to reconstructive or cosmetic surgeries? I know that there's a difference between the two, one being elective, one
Yeah.
being more necessary. And is it possible that some might even restrict it to entirely one or the other?
Yeah. So good question. And that's, again, before the end of my third year and I sort of did a rotation in plastic surgery, my understanding of it was that it was just aesthetic surgery, which there's nothing wrong with that. I enjoy aesthetic surgery. I do some aesthetic surgery, but that was all I knew it as. Um, but plastic surgery, there's so much more. It's such a broad field that really operates on every part of the body. And so that's what makes it a lot of fun. So there's definitely the distinction of like reconstructive and aesthetic. There's definitely some overlap and also some parts where they're definitely separate. Aesthetic being more doing some surgery to improve the someone's form, basically, the way they look, um, and as a result of aging or whatever. And so that's obviously elective surgery. Then there's reconstruction, which is sort of to give back something that's been taken away, either by cancer or by trauma or birth defects, things like that. So, you can dedicate yourself to one or the other. There's a lot of, probably the more common situation is people dedicating themselves 100% to aesthetic surgery. There are people that do 100% reconstructive surgery as well. And I'm sort of on more that end of the spectrum. I probably do 75 to 80% reconstruction and 25% aesthetic surgery. But the overlap comes in. So for instance, if someone has a mastectomy for breast cancer and has their breast removed and they're getting a reconstruction, either with an implant or using their own tissue. Now, the principles that I'm going to use for reconstruction are going to be very similar to the same principles I would use if I was doing a breast augmentation, because I'm trying to make this breast look as natural and as good as possible. And so that's kind of a lot of what the fun part of plastic surgery is you're tying in principles from a lot of different things. And it's really the one surgical specialty that is not controlled or not dictated by the part of the body. I may do on one day, I may do a free flap or basically moving tissue around to reconstruct a lower extremity wound. The next day, I may be doing a big abdominal hernia surgery. Then I might be doing a facelift or a facial fracture, or fixing a hand fracture. It's all over the body. It's also something that it's probably the most innovative field in the sense that we're constantly looking for new frontiers, with the biggest now being face transplantation and hand transplantation. So there's a lot of cool stuff to it. And I think it's a great specialty, and definitely one that anyone should consider.
Yeah, and speaking of the plastic surgery specialty, I want to get to passive income and other forms of income later, but about active
Yeah.
income that you actually dedicate your time to, and it's more time dependent, especially for plastic surgery. I'm sure that almost everyone, if they've kind of got used to this specialty, they notice that there's far more private practice than anyone who's kind of in an employee-based system, right? I
Yeah.
haven't personally heard of really any employee-based physicians who are plastic surgeons. Most of them are, usually in private practice or something similar. So I find it very interesting that there's a few other ways I've heard of, but I don't really know many details of them in terms of kind of hybrid forms between the employee-based system and the private practice. Are you familiar with any of those hybrid forms between the employee-based system and private practice? Both give their own benefits, but there's a few that I see that kind of take advantage of either side. Like, for example, with private practice, it allows for more autonomy as a physician instead of the administration separate from the physicians. And at the same time, with an employee-based system, it's not as heavy in terms of liability with malpractice and so on. So are you familiar with any of those hybrid forms of practicing medicine?
Yeah, there's definitely hybrid forms. So I am one of the well, definitely the minority. It's not a huge minority, but of plastic surgeons who are employed. So I'm a hospital employee. I have a pretty unique situation in the sense that while I'm an employee, we have complete autonomy. So it's kind of a weird unicorn kind of setup that's nice. But Yeah, the benefits you listed out are all exactly like you said them. There's definitely more freedom and autonomy within private practice in general to run your practice the way you want. Um, and then the downside is like if your practice is not doing good, then you just don't make money. Versus there's a little more of a floor or safety net with an employed position. But there's definitely hybrids where people work a certain percentage of time employed, and then they also have a private practice. Or even if they work and they're employed, but when they do aesthetic surgery, they get paid out of pocket for that with some sort of revenue sharing with their system. Um, so there's a lot of different kind of compensation models now, um, but there's pros and cons to any, and there's really good private practice setups, and there's really bad ones, and then the same goes for kind of an employed either university or hospital position.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear because personally, or I think I also speak for really many medical students or pre-medical students in specific, who maybe are exposed to shadowing, and that's really their main exposure with kind of physician details past just the normal specialty details, right? In terms of the compensation models, like you were discussing before. Personally, and I think for the rest of the for pre-medical students, they really only are familiar with the employee-based system and the private practice-based system. But I think it's definitely interesting to hear different hybrid forms of it. And it speaks to the flexibility that not only passive, but also active income gives for physicians and how they
Yeah,
can capitalize on that. But speaking of passive income, I wanted to also discuss that. So obviously, passive income is something that is not as talked about, and it might be definitely useful for pre-medical students to hear this early on. And in terms of passive income, I hear that it takes some time to set it up to a level where you're simply maintaining it. What are some examples, or just an example of a timeline that you might know of in terms of setting up an example of a passive income source? How long do you think it might
yeah,
take? What are the steps that usually go along with that?
yeah. That's a great question. So, kind of like you said, passive income is sort of income that is not it's not tied on a one-to-one ratio to your work. So like my work as a doctor, I get out of it as much as I put in. The effort I put in and what I get back is a one-to-one ratio. Versus passive income is, you put in a little bit of work and then money keeps generating itself. So there's a lot of, you know, forms of that. One form a lot of people are familiar with is even just investing in the stock market, where you invest a certain amount of money, and as the stocks hopefully go up, you make more money and you get paid dividends. Um, that that type of passive income is generally not a huge or significant source, especially for someone that's just starting out. But some of the more common things that provide passive income are like real estate investing, or like what you're doing, blogs and podcasts. And so I can give you an example. Passive income is something I became interested in as I sort of started on this financial journey. And so one way my wife and I do that is by investing in real estate and cash flowing real estate. So basically, we buy like duplexes or threeplexes, and we rent them out. And basically, the rent that we receive, we use that to pay off the mortgage, and then there's extra money that goes into our pocket. So that's something that there are certainly medical students and residents I know that are doing things like that. And one unique way, because it becomes a lot easier to do that once you are making an attending salary and can afford to, buy multiple properties. But one way you can do that as like a medical student or a resident is you could buy a duplex and live on one side. And when you do that, you don't have to put much money down. So you don't need a ton of startup money to do that, but you buy a duplex or a threeplex, you live in one unit, rent out the other ones, and use that rent to pay off your mortgage. And essentially you live for free and probably have some extra cash flow. These are things that take a while to build up. So for instance, my wife and I, we own 3 properties currently that we bought in the past year that we have rent coming in. Now we'll still need to buy more and more properties before it comes anywhere close to what we make from our active income. but we will get there in a number of years, and that's one way to kind of establish financial independence. Um, so the timeline is a longer one, but if there's anyone, I always say this, if there's anyone that can understand the long timeline, it's like someone who's going into medicine, because you, from the moment you decide you want to do that until you finally like get there. I mean, I almost can't even remember that far back. So I always find it funny because, like I said, physicians are just terrible with their finances. That's kind of like a stereotype that just fits. But we're so good at planning things out for the long term and being able to delay gratification in the one aspect, the professional, like kind of career aspect of our life, but we're so not good at it in other facets. So it's definitely a longer time horizon. Like, yeah, like at least, probably in the 5 to 10 year range. But that being said, I do know one psychiatry resident who became financially independent during residency from investing in real estate. So it's not to say it can't at all be done.
Yeah, and it's funny how you mentioned that we're so good at, like you said, delayed gratification with all this medical training, years and years of medical training. But when it comes to finances, the same doesn't really seem to apply.
It just doesn't. Yeah, there's some sort of block there.
Yeah, yeah, I really don't know why. But in terms of, like you mentioned, I was surprised to hear that there's like unique circumstances or maybe just a few medical students, residents who are actually striving for that financial freedom through passive income resources already before even becoming an attending. That was really interesting. So are there any, in terms of, obviously, we mentioned a little about the schedule for medical students, the schedule for residents.
Mhm.
They are in the middle of medical education, medical training, so they might not have as much time. Passive income does play, a better fit into that. But like we mentioned, or like you mentioned, it's something that does take some time to set up. So in terms of the medical student versus the resident, do you think there's a big difference between certain types of passive income sources that fit each schedule for, say, a medical student versus a resident?
Yeah, I think, and it depends again on the residency and stuff. I think it's probably similar. Like I think with real estate investing, it's a potential option because with real estate investing and doing it the right way, and I can go a lot more into this. But it takes a lot of upfront work, and then it really does become passive. So if you're able to, plan out during a light period or a light rotation or something like that, all that kind of startup work, then it can really become passive. It does obviously help if you have a partner or something who is able to help out with that as well, even if they're in the medical field as well. Um, but I think the biggest the biggest thing is, like I was kind of saying earlier, just by minimizing debts, by learning to save a percentage of your income and just investing that simply, even in just the stock market and like index funds. And again, that's something I could go more into, but investing in something for the long term that's going to approximate the overall stock market, which has basically always gone up over history. Just doing that, which is extremely passive. You don't need to check your stocks or anything like that. You basically just kind of leave it. Just doing that as a physician, like you are going to be fine. Like if you create those habits and then enact them, especially once you get to the attending level, you're going to be 100% just fine. Um, so for the people listening that are like, oh gosh, is this financial freedom, financial independence, is this only available to me if I'm like going to become a real estate investor or start doing these more complex things? No, it's really just these simple habits.
Yeah. Going back to the compensation models, I just wanted to ask one more thing.
Yeah.
We talked about plastic surgery, how that's a little more oriented around private practice. I see that kind of the same applies for other specialties. You see specialties that are more employee or private practice
Mhm.
leaning, right? Are there any specialties that you think would be more optimized for those hybrid models that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, honestly, it's kind of becoming where almost anything can be, because there's a lot of, internal medicine, for instance, would be one, or family medicine, let's say, would be one that traditionally you kind of think, well, that's really going to always kind of be more of a even if it's private practice, it's going to be more insurance based and stuff like that. But now it's not. There's a lot of places that are going to a more out of pocket or subscription model. So I think physicians are getting creative, which is probably a response to like insurance companies not really compensating appropriately or putting a lot of delays and holds on patients' treatments and payments and stuff like that. So physicians are starting to get creative to both care for the patients and to make sure that they're fairly compensated. So, in just about every specialty, I've seen really, really creative arrangements. And that's an interesting fact that I didn't really put together or realize until recently is everyone's always really worried in medical school, and I was, along with my classmates, the same way, sort of in picking what specialty they would go to. It'd always be like, well, I really love pediatrics, but that tends to be a lower compensated specialty compared to, say, plastic surgery or something like that. But in reality, the difference in pay between specialties is a lot less. That sort of delta is a lot less than the difference in pays within a specialty. There's pediatricians making $800,000, $1 million a year, and there's pediatricians making $150,000 a year. And it's because people are seeking out different compensation models, et cetera. And again, not that should be the driving factor. You should choose what you're passionate about. But I think that almost supports that find what you're passionate about, and you're going to be able to establish a model that compensates you well enough.
Absolutely. So I think all in all, we've covered a lot in terms of compensation models, passive income, active income. In general, do you have any tips for future doctors listening in, particularly for financial management or any other topics you'd like to mention?
My biggest tip, it's not even so much a tip or like a pep talk, I guess, but like, you're going to be fine financially. I was so worried for so long because we do get in so much debt. And, like I said, I had $500,000 in debt, credit card debt. I had no savings. I had 2 kids. I really, and I had zero knowledge at all. But even with that, like, with just some education, you will be okay. So if you've had to take loans out, if you were worried that you haven't managed them correctly so far, if you are worried that you've dug yourself too deep a hole, that even though you're going to be paid a lot of money, you won't be able to get out of it, or you'll constantly be in this hamster wheel. It's not going to be like that, and it doesn't have to be like that. You can do things to change that, and the first step is just starting to learn a little bit about it, and it's definitely not as hard as it seems. So that's always my biggest message.
Yeah, that sounds great. Just a few things about the compensation models that I kind of have been thinking about as we're talking here.
Yeah.
What about a percentage-based compensation model? I'm not too familiar if that's available or not, but is it possible that physicians can take a percentage instead of just a base salary with then bonuses and things like RVUs on top of that are regulated across specialties? Is it possible that they can make more of a unique and, like I said, hybrid compensation model where they are taking a certain percentage of profits and having things like liability and staff covered as almost like a private practice model that's being compensated for by the hospital since they're working for the
Yeah.
hospital?
Yeah, there is, like, there's certain people where I trained that are on like a profit loss model, where essentially they're employed by the hospital, but the way they're paid is essentially the hospital looks at all the money they bring in and total it up based on the surgeries they do and the insurance, what they pay, and then they subtract out all of their expenses, so things like their office overhead, the cost of like the nurses and the scrub techs and the equipment and the materials they use in the OR, and basically whatever that difference is between the total income and the total expenses, that's what they make. And that works good for some people. Where it gets into trouble is, sometimes, whether it's surgery or internal medicine or pediatrics or anesthesia or whatever, sometimes you're going to have insurances that pay really great money, and that's profit loss is going to be a great model for you. But if that these are just examples that are, kind of on the tip of my tongue because it's what I deal with. But if you're let's say a gender affirmation surgeon, that you do gender affirmation surgery, a lot of those patients tend to have, say, more like Medicaid or public insurance that is not going to reimburse as much for these really complicated procedures. So if you have a profit loss model with that, you're not going to do as well as someone who's dealing with patients that have really good private insurance. So it's so much, like, once you kind of go down the rabbit hole, there's so many variables to try and kind of sort out. But they will always sort themselves out. And honestly, I feel, and I've experienced, if you follow your passion and just do what you're passionate about, like all this, the financial stuff in terms of getting compensated will work itself out.
Yeah, and I'm not sure about the legality. Again, this is something that just was off the top of my head in terms of a percentage-based compensation model. I'm not sure about the legality of how that would work in terms of the profit side of thing, where physicians are basically almost determining their profits in one way or another by
Yeah.
labs, things like that, and how much they will, how many labs they're going to order, things like that, that they do for patients, and that is
Mhm.
dependent upon their choice. The more labs they order, the greater profit they will have. And obviously, that might be an incentive for some physicians to
Yeah.
take profit over a patient's well-being and expenses.
Yeah.
So, do you know about the legality behind that? Are you familiar at all?
It's always, I mean, doing that is obviously illegal. But in terms of it's very much gray area, because in terms of proving that or anything like that, it's very difficult. And it's just, the ethics of the physician determine that. And obviously, we all take an oath to be ethical and put our patients first. But that's certainly a potential issue with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes back to the earlier question we had before about patient populations choosing between, in your specialty, with plastic surgery, reconstructive versus cosmetic. Some might be more of an incentive for others, but it's not necessarily
Hmm.
something that you're going to be able to necessarily point out if that is the physician's motive. It's might just like look
Yeah.
like it's um, just their kind of area of expertise in the
Right.
specialty. So
Yeah. No, for sure.
so yeah, that's something to look at. And one last question before we do end today. We
Hmm.
discussed in the very beginning about how financial well-being kind of translates to becoming a better doctor. I think that there
Yeah.
was some insight to say about that, and that's one of the points I actually really wanted to discuss with you, even ahead of you mentioning that. I think that was a great point that you mentioned, and great insight that's not looked into as much as it should be. But about that, how do you think that really translates into becoming a better doctor? Is it that it's just the mental health behind it, the stress that you accumulate with more and more financial burdens, and with better financial well-being and less stress, you become a better doctor? Or is it the time that you expend on things financially related when you are deep down in those financial burdens?
Yeah. I think it's a little bit of everything. I think there's a lot of, your mental well-being, your overall well-being increases because finances, like, just in general, not even talking about physicians, just people in general, is like, I'm pretty sure it's the number one cause of stress. I don't know what the actual surveys say, but I mean, that's got to be the case. And so just relieving some of that is huge. Um, I think also in terms of physicians, and again, I'll kind of talk about this from the perspective of a surgeon, but it applies to anything. There's too many surgeons I've seen and continue to see that, like, it might be Friday night and they have plans with their family, but they're trying to squeeze in another surgery because they want to make more money rather than, say, waiting another for a different time or something like that, because they want more RVUs or they want to increase their profit loss, because they have all these expenses that they need to catch up on. They haven't planned things out financially appropriately. And that's something that makes you that leads to burnout, that leads to resentment, because you feel like the hospital is taking away your time from your family, etc. Because I never feel like I have to do that, or people picking up extra shifts, like emergency room doctors or anesthesiologists or whoever, people picking up extra shifts because they need to make that more money rather than spend time with their family or just spend time on themselves, on their, personal well-being. So I think those are two really big aspects of it.
Yeah. I think that goes on to say how there's a fine line between becoming financially independent and then past that, becoming more financially greedy. There's a fine line between the two, and if you cross that line,
Exactly.
it's it's a dangerous line to cross because it ends up consuming your life more than it should. And finances is just a way of sustaining things, and obviously you can have
That's exactly
entertainment
it.
along with that, luxuries behind that, but in the end, it's not really something that will benefit anyone to get greedy over because you'll want more and more. But I'd love to
Exactly.
discuss, yeah, I'd love to discuss for
No,
hours on this. I really wish we had more time, but for anyone listening in who's really interested in what you have to say in the topics that we discussed, I know that you have a blog, a few blog posts on your website. Um, are there any specific posts that you would recommend to aspiring physicians listening in as to what they could do for financial management?
yeah, I would say, just head over to my site. It's prudentplasticsurgeon.com. I put out a new post every day. So there's a lot of them, and I have a lot geared towards just medical students or residents. You can just type that into the search bar and they'll all come up. You can also email me at jordan@prudentplasticsurgeon.com. I'm happy to answer any questions. So yeah, definitely just reach out. Like I said, I'm really passionate about this. And just to dovetail off of the last thing you said, you hit it completely on the head, and it's so good that you're seeing it that way now. But money is just a tool. And the way I view it, it's a tool to try to make our lives and the lives of other people as good as possible. And so that's all money is good for. It's purely a tool. And if you're just looking at it for itself, then once you start achieving it, it's going to be completely empty. It's just to help make us in the world a better place. So yeah, and thanks for all you do. I wish I wish this was around when I was a medical student. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to discuss hours more. I really have so many topics I'd love to discuss. We discussed a few, though. We covered a lot, and I'm sure that people listening in will find this very useful, especially being so early on in the process. They can really utilize it that much more later on.
Exactly.
It's really great to have you on, Dr. Frey. And I just want to mention one more thing. Do you have any socials that you want to include for anyone listening in to look into? Any other things besides your website?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm on like most of the social media. I guess I can't say all anymore. But yeah, on Facebook, I'm just Jordan Fry. On Instagram and Twitter, it's Jordan Fry, MD, FREY. So yeah, just type me in and check me out or message me, whatever.
All right, that sounds great. Thank you so much, Dr. Fry, for coming in and taking time out of your schedule to join us today. And thank you for our audience tuning in to another episode of Setting the Scene.